Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today's video is a simple one and a bit of a follow-up to my review of the Asus ROG Swift PG27UQ that we published a couple of days ago. That video is pretty long as it is, but there was one thing I decided to cut out for time reasons, and that's the performance impact of playing games in the HDR mode compared to the standard SDR mode. Now you might be thinking, surely there is no performance impact opting to play in HDR compared to SDR. After all, you're basically playing at the same quality settings with the same textures, the same character and object models, same shadows and so forth. But the reality is that switching on HDR, and specifically HDR with G-Sync, does impact your frame rate in certain games, and that's something we'll be exploring in this video. Couple of notes before we show the benchmarks. All testing was done on my personal rig, which includes a Ryzen 7 1700X overclocked to 3.9 GHz, 32 GB of DDR4 3000 memory, and an NVIDIA GeForce Titan X Pascal, which, if you might recall, is around the level of a GTX 1080 Ti. The monitor I'm using is, of course, the Asus PG27UQ, which is a 4K 144Hz 10-bit HDR panel with G-Sync HDR support. However, for most of this analysis, I used the monitor at 98Hz to avoid Chroma subsampling, though I'll show you the impact of subsampling later. All games were played at 4K with ultra quality settings, the only two differences being whether the HDR toggle was enabled or disabled in the game, and whether G-Sync was enabled or disabled. The other thing to note is this performance analysis only applies to G-Sync HDR at this point. I plan on revisiting the topic when I get my hands on a FreeSync 2 monitor to see whether AMD GPUs are impacted, particularly when more games come out with FreeSync 2's special HDR processing pipeline. But for now, we're just testing with an NVIDIA GPU and the current best HDR display on the market. Let's get into the benchmark, starting with Star Wars Battlefront 2, which has an okay HDR implementation, but it's definitely not the best I've seen. You'll see here there are three configurations we've tested with: the standard SDR mode with G-Sync enabled, HDR but with G-Sync disabled, and then finally both HDR and G-Sync enabled. As I mentioned earlier, we're testing at 4K ultra settings with the monitor set to 98Hz and connecting over DisplayPort. The first thing you'll notice is all three modes deliver different performance. The best mode in terms of performance is the SDR mode, and just in case you are wondering, there is no difference in performance between G-Sync on or off in the SDR mode in this game or any other game I tested with. Then, switching to the HDR mode with G-Sync off reduces performance by 4% in average frame rates, but the big hit comes when you enable both HDR and G-Sync. It's here that frame rates are 13% lower than the SDR mode on average and 11% lower in 1% lows. The results here in Battlefront 2 are painting a rather interesting picture about HDR and specifically G-Sync HDR, but let's do some further testing. Hitman has the oldest HDR implementation of any game I'm testing with, and in this game, the impact from HDR is a lot lower. While HDR does reduce performance by around 3 to 4%, there is no significant difference between G-Sync on or off in the HDR mode. Assassin's Creed Origins performs more similarly to Battlefront 2 in terms of the impact HDR has on performance. Merely enabling HDR cuts down performance by 6%, but enabling HDR and G-Sync sees frame rates hit by 11%. G-Sync here is having a surprisingly large impact considering it has no impact when running the game in the SDR mode. Far Cry 5 is the only game I tested where there is no appreciable performance difference between the HDR and SDR modes. Far Cry 5 has, in my opinion, the best HDR implementation available in a game today, and it also supports AMD's FreeSync 2 technology. Perhaps this game is using a different, newer HDR implementation that does not result in a performance hit. It's really hard to say at this point. Middle-earth Shadow of War does not have a built-in HDR switch. Instead, it relies on your Windows HDR and WCG setting to determine whether to use HDR or not. This game is impacted by HDR processing in that you get a 5% performance hit from simply enabling HDR, while G-Sync HDR takes a huge 14% hit. The final game I tested was Battlefield 1, and it's a similar story here. Enabling HDR results in a 4% hit to frame rates, and that jumps up to 11% when G-Sync is added into the mix. It's no surprise that these results are nearly identical to Star Wars Battlefront 2 because both Battlefield 1 and Battlefront 2 use the same Frostbite engine. And for those wondering whether 422 Chroma subsampling impacts performance on the PG27UQ when you bump up the refresh rate to 144Hz, you'll be glad to hear it does not hurt performance whatsoever. Here are the Star Wars Battlefront 2 results, and the results with G-Sync HDR and Chroma subsampling are essentially identical to the results without subsampling enabled. This set of benchmarks is an interesting one. We have 4 games that are noticeably impacted by G-Sync HDR and HDR in general. Battlefield 1, Battlefront 2, Assassin's Creed Origins, and Shadow of War. All 4 are impacted in roughly the same way, with HDR reducing frame rates by approximately 4% and G-Sync HDR reducing performance by 12%, both compared to SDR. But then there's Far Cry 5, which shows no performance impact, and Hitman, which is slightly impacted by HDR, but G-Sync appears to make little difference. With these sorts of results, you can't simply say that enabling HDR or G-Sync HDR will impact performance in every situation. It appears to be a case where some engines need to do a significant amount of extra processing to support HDR, such as the Frostbite engine, which results in a performance hit, while others use a different HDR technique that doesn't impact performance as significantly. Considering there are many differences already between game engines, this varied approach to HDR with a varied performance hit sounds fairly typical. The more interesting situation here is when you add G-Sync into the mix alongside HDR. The performance hit in some games is substantial. A game like Shadow of War in its HDR mode sees a 10% performance penalty from simply enabling G-Sync, and that's definitely not an ideal situation. You can sort of stomach the performance hit from just enabling HDR, as there is a visual quality improvement. As we know, most other settings that improve visual quality impact performance, but it's disappointing that enabling G-Sync as well, which has 0 performance hit in SDR games, also hits frame rates in some titles. G-Sync, I guess it does improve smoothness and the overall experience, so for a lot of gamers it's going to be worth that performance hit, particularly at 4K. But I don't think enabling adaptive sync should come at such a high cost. It seems that for some games at least, the driver needs to do a fair bit of heavy lifting to package up both adaptive sync and HDR metadata into the display signal so that the G-Sync HDR module on the display side can process it with minimal latency. With G-Sync disabled, the module is effectively bypassed, so less PC side packaging and processing is required for the HDR signal. And then for some games, the HDR pipeline is designed such that far less driver-side work needs to be done. At least that's what this data seems to be indicating. While it's not good to see HDR or G-Sync impact performance in some games, the results in Far Cry 5 are promising. In this title, there was no impact when switching on HDR or G-Sync, and the HDR implementation is visually excellent, so there's a chance that other upcoming games will be able to implement HDR in a similar way. After all, we are only in the early stages of HDR support on PC, so it could take a few iterations to work these sorts of things out. That's it for this short look at HDR game performance. If you like our display related coverage, consider supporting us on Patreon to get access to our exclusive Discord chat. Steve and I are both pretty active in there, chatting with you guys every day, so it's definitely worth signing up. I've got to go test some more monitors now, so I'll definitely see you in the next one.